My son shoved me into the refrigerator last night hard enough to crack the handle. This morning, I got up at 5, made his favorite meal biscuits and sausage gravy, hash browns, strong black coffee, and set the kitchen table like it was Thanksgiving. When my son came downstairs and saw it, he laughed, not warmly, the kind of laugh that says, "You finally broke." He pulled out his chair, sat down, spread a napkin across his lap like a king taking his throne, and said, "Now that's what I'm talking about, old man. Maybe you're finally learning how things work around here." He reached for the gravy. That's when someone knocked on my front door. Not a casual knock. 3 firm, deliberate strikes. My son's hand froze over the bowl. He turned toward the hallway. I stood up slowly, walked toward the door, and opened it. Standing on my porch in the gray Ohio morning were 2 people who made my son's face go the color of old chalk. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a 6'5" man ends up setting a trap for his own child. My name is Walter Greer. Everyone calls me Walt. Born and raised in Centerville, Ohio, just south of Dayton. Spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, mostly commercial work schools, hospitals, a few big box stores. Retired at 62 on decent terms. I built the house my wife, Helen, and I lived in for 27 years. Not with my hands the way carpenters do, but I rewired it twice, added the back room addition, put in the new kitchen myself. Helen always said the house was half mine and half her stubbornness. She was right about most things. I lost Helen to ovarian cancer 19 months ago, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the day I buried her. The speed of it was the worst part. No time to prepare, no time to say half of what needed saying. Just here, and then gone. I have one son, Daniel Allen Greer, Danny, 38 years old. When Helen was alive, Danny lived in Columbus, had a decent job doing logistics coordination for a shipping company, had an apartment, had a girlfriend named Trish that none of us talked about because she came and went like weather. He called on Sundays, visited at Christmas and Easter, seemed to be building a life. After Helen died, that version of my son began disappearing. Not all at once. Slowly, the way a photograph fades if you leave it in the sun. 7 months ago, Danny called on a Wednesday night around 9. I remember the time because I'd just turned off the TV and was heading to bed early the way I'd started doing since the house got quiet. He said he'd lost his job. Restructuring, he said. His apartment lease was up in 3 weeks. Could he stay with me for a little while, just until he got back on his feet? I said yes without hesitating. He was my son. The house had 3 bedrooms and 1 occupant. What kind of father would say no? I told myself it would be good for both of us. Company in the evenings, someone to share meals with. Stupid. I was stupid, and I was lonely, and I mistook one for the other. The first month was almost fine. Danny settled into his old room. He helped with yard work, watched football with me on weekends, ate dinner at the table. He was quiet, a little sullen, but I chalked that up to the blow of losing his job. I gave him space. I told myself grieving a career was real grief. I was patient. I am my father's son in that way, maybe too patient, maybe in the wrong directions. The drinking started around week 6. Not right away obvious, not falling down drunk. Just a 6-pack most evenings, then a 12-pack, then something harder. Whiskey, usually. A bottle on the kitchen counter that refilled itself. I didn't say anything the first few times. Helen was the one who knew how to approach Danny when something was wrong. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and just wait, and eventually he'd talk. I don't have that skill. I have a straight line and I know how to wire things, but I never learned how to navigate around my son's edges the way Helen did. The first time Danny raised his voice at me, I was standing at the sink washing dishes. He came in from the garage, smelling like whiskey and cold air, and I made the mistake of asking whether he'd had any luck with the job applications I knew he'd been putting in. His response was not an answer. It was a wall. You know what, Dad? Not every conversation has to be an interrogation. His voice had a heat to it I hadn't heard before. I'm doing what I can. You want to check my browser history too? Make sure I'm doing enough? I said I was just asking. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet hard enough that I thought it might break, poured himself a drink, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stood there at the sink with my hands still wet, telling myself he was stressed, telling myself it was understandable. The lies we tell ourselves are always the smoothest ones. Over the following weeks, the voice raising became regular. Any question about job searching, any comment about the empty bottles, any mention of money he'd asked to borrow $400 in his second month, and when I gently asked about repayment, he looked at me like I'd accused him of a crime. Are you seriously tracking that? After everything you put me through growing up? I didn't know what everything meant. I still don't, not fully. Helen would have known what to say. I just stood there, absorbing it, telling myself he was grieving the life he'd planned and hadn't gotten. I want to explain something, because I've seen the looks people give when someone admits to staying in a situation like this. I've seen it on the faces of my neighbor Dolores, who I'm sure suspected something was wrong from the sounds that came through the walls. I've seen it in the eyes of my old buddy Frank when I made excuses at church. The look that says, "Why didn't you just do something?" Here's the answer I wish I'd known how to give back then. When the person hurting you is someone you raised, someone you held the night they had fever at age 4, someone whose first baseball glove you bought with your first overtime check, the shame doesn't come from being hurt. The shame comes from what the hurt means. It means you failed. It means the boy you spent 38 years trying to raise right turned out wrong, and some part of you believes that failure lives in your bones. So you don't call it what it is. You call it a rough patch. You call it grief. You call it anything except the word that fits. 3 months in, Danny stopped pretending to look for work. He slept until noon most days, came downstairs to eat whatever I'd made, watched television in the living room, like a man in a hotel. One evening I came in from the garage where I'd been working on a lamp repair. I take small electrical jobs in retirement, nothing big, and found him sitting in Helen's chair. The rocking chair she'd had since before we were married, the one her mother had given her. He was sitting in it with a whiskey glass on the armrest, watching something loud on his phone with no headphones in. I said, "Danny, that's your mother's chair." He looked up at me slowly. "She's not using it," he said. Then he turned back to his phone. I went to bed early that night and lay in the dark trying to remember the last time I'd felt at ease in my own home. The first time it turned physical, I told myself it was an accident. We were arguing in the kitchen. I'd found a letter from the electric company, a past due notice on an account I hadn't opened. Danny had been taking the mail before I could get to it, and I'd found out he'd applied for a credit card in my name and fallen behind on it. When I confronted him with the letter, he denied it. I pressed him. His face went red the way it used to when he was a teenager, and I'd caught him in something. He stepped toward me, shoulder first, and I moved back into the counter. He said the contact was incidental, that I was crowding him. My hip ached for a week. I convinced myself he hadn't meant it. I called my friend Frank Abernathy about 2 weeks after that. Frank is 70, a former Greene County Sheriff's deputy who retired a decade ago and now spends his time woodworking and being the most reliably honest person I know. We've been friends since our kids played Little League together. I didn't tell him everything. I told him Danny was struggling, that there'd been some tension, that I was worried. Frank listened in that quiet way he has, the way that means he's hearing more than you're saying. He asked me directly if Danny had put his hands on me. I said no. Frank let the silence sit long enough that I almost changed my answer. Then he said, "Walt, my door is open any time, day or night, and I mean any time." He said it the way you say something when you want the other person to understand every word separately. I told him I appreciated it. We hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after. I started recording because of the lamp. There's a work lamp I keep on the shelf in my garage, an old industrial one I've had for years, and it has a small clip I use to mount a phone for watching repair tutorials. One evening, Danny followed me out to the garage mid-argument. I'd gone out there to get away from him and kept going. I watched him stand in my garage and tell me I was pathetic, that I'd wasted my life on a dead-end trade, that I'd made him ashamed his whole childhood, things that I had no response to because they landed somewhere deep and unexpected. When he finally went back inside and slammed the garage door, I looked at my phone still clipped to the lamp. It had been recording the whole time. I sat down on my stool and played it back. His voice through the small speaker sounded different from how it sounded in the room. More naked somehow. More like what it was. I sat there for a long time. Then I plugged the phone in, cleared the storage, opened the voice memo app and labeled a new file. November 14, garage. I pressed record and put it back on the clip, angled toward the door. I told myself I was probably overreacting. I wasn't. Over the next 2 months, I recorded 41 separate incidents, mostly in the kitchen and living room. Yelling, insults, 2 instances of him grabbing objects and throwing them not at me, but near me. The kind of near that's a message. Once he threw a coffee mug against the wall 2 feet to my left. I had ceramic dust in my hair. He told me I flinched because I was weak. I didn't say what I was thinking. I was thinking about the phone on the counter behind the fruit bowl. Red light blinking steady. I was building something. I didn't know yet exactly what I was building toward, but I knew I wasn't wasting it. The night everything changed was a Friday in January. Cold, icy, the kind of Ohio winter that gets into the walls of old houses. Danny had been out since mid-afternoon. I knew where he'd been by the sound of his truck coming back too fast on the ice, overcorrecting in the driveway, engine cut off wrong. I heard him in the mudroom knocking something over. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of decaf and the crossword I'd been ignoring for 20 minutes. I heard him come down the hallway. There are sounds a drunk person makes moving through a quiet house that you can't unlearn once you've learned them. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. His face was flushed, eyes not tracking quite right. He looked at me at the table, at the cup in my hands, and something shifted in his expression. Something I can only describe as contempt. Not anger, not grief. Pure contempt, the way you look at something you've decided has no value. Still up, he said. It wasn't a question. I said I was. He came into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, stood there, staring into it for too long. You eat the leftover chili? I told him I had. At lunch. Of course you did. He closed the refrigerator, turned around, looked at me again. You know what your problem is? I recognized the tone. I'd heard it enough times to know where it went. I kept my voice neutral. I said I was going to bed. I stood up. I made the mistake of moving toward the counter where my phone was. He stepped in front of me. Not to stop me. I think, maybe not intentionally, but the step was aggressive. The way a man plants himself when he wants you to know the space belongs to him. I moved to go around him, and he put both hands on my chest and shoved. Not once. Twice. The first shove sent me back into the counter edge. The second, faster, harder, sent me into the refrigerator. The handle caught my shoulder. I heard it crack the handle, not my shoulder, though my shoulder didn't feel much better. I hit the floor mostly controlled, one knee down, one hand catching the cabinet door. Danny stood over me, breathing hard. His face had the satisfaction in it again. He said something I'm not going to repeat because it had Helen's name in it, and there are things she deserves not to be near. Then he went upstairs. His door closed hard enough that the picture in the hallway rattled. I stayed on the floor for a moment. Not hurt badly, not concussed, just still. The phone was on the counter above me, red light blinking behind the fruit bowl. I reached up and pressed stop. Then I sat on the kitchen floor in the silence and looked at my hands. They were steady. That surprised me more than anything. I expected fear. What I felt instead was a kind of cold clearness, the way the air gets right before a big weather system moves through. I thought about my father. He was a quiet man, a railroad man, and he believed that a man handled his own house. He'd had a brother who made bad choices, and the family covered for him for years because that's what you did. My father died at 67, believing that silence was dignity. I was 65. I was not going to spend whatever time I had left being a lesson about the wrong kind of patience. I got up off the floor. I walked to the hallway bathroom, ran cold water, looked at myself in the mirror. The shoulder was already bruising under my shirt. I lifted the fabric and looked. Purple, yellow-edged. I took 3 photos with my phone in the bathroom light. Then I walked to the garage. I sat at my workbench and I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Frank Abernathy. He answered on the second ring, which told me he wasn't deeply asleep or he'd been waiting. I told him what had happened. Not the history, not the long version, just tonight. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you need, Walt." I told him I needed him at my house at 7 in the morning, and I needed him to bring someone from the sheriff's department he trusted. He said he'd be there. No questions, no hesitation. That's Frank. The second call was to Lieutenant Carol Simmons, who I knew from the First Community Church men's breakfast, and who I knew from context was a domestic violence investigator with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. I didn't know her well. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times, but I knew she was serious, and I knew she was straight. I left a message with the on-call desk asking her to call me back on an urgent personal matter. She called back in 11 minutes. I told her I was 65. I was the victim of a domestic assault in my own home tonight. The perpetrator was my adult son, who was currently asleep upstairs. I had 2 months of audio recordings and tonight's incident documented, and I wanted to handle this by the book, with dignity, in the morning. She asked if I was safe right now. I told her I was. She said she'd come at 7. She said if anything changed before then, I should call 911 immediately. The third call was to my brother Raymond in Indiana, because I needed someone in the family to know what was happening in case something happened between now and morning. Raymond is 68, a steadier man than I'll ever be. He went quiet when I told him. Then he said he was proud of me and that he'd drive down if I needed him. I told him to stay put, but thank you. Hearing his voice helped more than I expected. I spent the rest of the night in the garage. I didn't sleep. I sat at my workbench and I played back some of the recordings on my phone. Not all of them. Just enough to remind myself that what I'd lived for the past months was real. There's a thing that happens when you're on the receiving end of sustained cruelty inside your own home. You start to doubt your own accounting of events. The other person's reality gets louder than yours. The recordings made my reality louder. Danny's voice through the speaker. My voice, quiet, careful, trying to manage and de-escalate and absorb. The sounds of things breaking. The sounds of me flinching. Clear as anything. At 5 in the morning, I went inside. Danny was snoring upstairs. I stood in the kitchen and looked at it for a moment, the refrigerator with the cracked handle, the scuff marks on the floor from last night. Then I got out the skillets. I'd thought about this during the long hours in the garage. In our family, important things happened at the table. Helen always said you didn't have hard conversations standing up. You sat down, you had something in front of you, and you faced each other like people. I was going to end this at my table. I was going to do it the right way. I made sausage gravy from scratch, Helen's recipe, the one written on an index card in her handwriting that I keep in the recipe box on the second shelf. I made biscuits, hash browns from real potatoes, not frozen. I made a full pot of coffee and let the smell carry through the house the way it did on Sunday mornings when things were right. I set the table with the good placemats, the ones Helen bought at a church bazaar that she called the fancy ones, even though they weren't fancy, just nicer than the vinyl ones. 4 settings, one for me at the head, one for Danny across from me, 2 others, side by side, for the people who were coming. I went upstairs, showered without waking Danny, got dressed in clean clothes, dark trousers, the navy button-down I wear to funerals and depositions, my shoes buffed. I looked in the bathroom mirror. The bruise on my shoulder wasn't visible under the shirt. I rolled up the sleeve and photographed it again in the morning light. Better than last night's photos. Then I rolled the sleeve back down. I was ready. I went back downstairs, poured myself a coffee, and sat at the head of the table. The clock on the microwave read 6:48. I folded my hands and waited. Frank arrived at 2 minutes to 7, which meant he'd left before 6. He was in his good coat, the charcoal wool one he wears to church. He looked at my face the way old friends look when they've known you through enough things to read you without much words. He put a hand on my shoulder, the good one, and came inside. A minute later, Lieutenant Simmons pulled up in a county vehicle. She was in uniform, badge catching the low January light. Behind her was a younger deputy named Torres, who she introduced without ceremony. They came in, looked at the table, at the food still steaming, at me sitting at the head. Simmons took out a small notebook. She asked to see the recordings before we proceeded. I handed her my phone. She listened to 2 minutes of a mid-December recording, her face professional and still. She handed it back. "This is sufficient," she said. "We'll take a full copy in the formal statement." She and Torres positioned themselves near the kitchen doorway, visible from the dining room, but not the first thing you'd see coming down the stairs. Frank sat at the table to my right. We waited. I heard Danny's alarm go off at 7:15. He'd set it, I realized, because he had something going on, a meeting with a guy about some cash work he'd mentioned vaguely. The irony of that was not lost on me. The shower ran for 8 minutes. I heard him moving around upstairs. The particular weight of his footsteps I'd learned the way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in a long time. Then the stairs. He always took them fast, had since he was a kid. I heard him reach the bottom, heard him pause in the hall, and then he came around the corner into the dining room following the smell. He stopped. His eyes went to the table first, the food, the placemats, the full spread. His face did something complicated. He'd come downstairs braced for whatever aftermath last night might bring, and instead found this. I watched him read it wrong. I watched him decide it meant what he wanted it to mean. A slow smile started. Not a good smile. The kind of smile that confirms something the smiler already believed. He walked to the table, pulled out his chair, sat down with the ease of a man who's decided he's won. He poured himself a coffee without asking, leaned back, looked at the food, looked at me. "Okay," he said. "This is more like it." He reached for the biscuits. "See, Dad? This is all I ever wanted. A little respect." He bit into a biscuit. Crumbs on the placemats. Was that so hard? I didn't say anything. I watched him. He was chewing, comfortable, satisfied, the way a man looks when he believes the world has rearranged itself to suit him. He hadn't looked past me yet. He hadn't looked at the doorway. "You know," he started, "if we'd just established some ground rules from the beginning, we wouldn't have." He stopped. Something in my expression made him stop. I wasn't looking down. I wasn't looking away. I was looking at him with the particular kind of stillness that I think he'd never quite seen on my face before. His smile shifted. His eyes narrowed. "What?" he said. He looked at the table again. Noticed the 4 place settings. Noticed the 2 he hadn't accounted for. "Who else is?" He turned around. Frank was sitting to my right, hands folded on the table, watching Danny with the quiet authority of a man who spent 30 years deciding who went to jail and who went home. His expression was not angry. It was something colder and more permanent than anger. It was judgment that had already been rendered. Danny's eyes moved to the doorway. Lieutenant Simmons stood in full uniform, notebook in her left hand, her right hand resting at her side near her belt. Deputy Torres stood slightly behind her. Younger, broader, his posture the kind of professional stillness that takes training to maintain. The biscuit in Danny's hand dropped to the table. He pushed back from his chair, got to his feet, and for a moment he looked exactly like he did at 15 when I caught him with a lie so large he didn't know which direction to fall. "What is this?" His voice came out wrong, too high, cracking at the edge. "Dad, what the hell is this?" I let the silence hold for 1 second. 2. Then I said, calmly, "Sit down, Danny." He didn't sit. He looked at Frank. "Frank, what are you?" Frank said, "Sit down, son." Not unkindly. With the weight of it, Danny sat. His hands found the edge of the table and gripped it. Lieutenant Simmons stepped forward and introduced herself and Torres. She explained that she was a domestic violence investigator with the county, that she was there on my request following an assault that occurred in this residence the previous evening, and that she was going to need to ask him some questions. Danny's face cycled through 4 or 5 things in fast succession. He landed on the thing people land on when the ground disappears, anger, because anger is the only floor some people know. "He called the cops on me? His own son? For what? We had an argument?" Simmons said, "Your father sustained physical injuries consistent with being forcibly pushed into the refrigerator in this kitchen. We've photographed those injuries, and they're documented. Would you like to address that?" Danny said. "It was an accident. I was drunk. I wasn't." He stopped himself. He'd just said several things he didn't mean to say. I watched him realize it. I reached into my shirt pocket and set my phone on the table. Danny's eyes went to it immediately. He knew what it was. He'd seen me use it 100 times. He just didn't know what it had been doing. "I've been recording," I said. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, as a fact. For about 2 months, Danny's jaw went tight. "That's illegal," Frank said. "Ohio is a one-party consent state, Danny. Your father can record any conversation he's a party to, in his own home." I watched Danny process that, and find no exit in it. I pressed play. His voice came through the speaker. 4 weeks ago, a Wednesday night. "You know what you are? You're a placeholder. You're just something taking up space until I figure out what I'm actually supposed to do with my life." A pause. "Don't look at me like that. You always look at me like that. Like I'm a disappointment." "Well, guess what, Dad? The feeling is mutual." I stopped it. The room was very quiet. I played a second one. The mug against the wall. The sound of it hitting and shattering. The spray of it. And then Danny's voice. Low and close. Next time I won't aim for the wall. I stopped it. Simmons was writing. Torres had shifted slightly. Frank's hands were still folded, but his knuckles were white. Danny had stopped gripping the table. His hands were now in his lap, and he was looking at the phone the way you look at something you can't argue with, can't bargain with, can't explain. "Dad," he said. His voice was different now, smaller, scraped out. "I need you to understand that I didn't mean." He stopped, looked at Frank, looked at Simmons, looked at me. "I'm going to get help. I swear to you. I'll go to treatment. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't." I let him finish. I let the silence sit after. Then I said, "Danny, when your mother was sick, you called every Sunday. You drove down 3 times those 7 weeks. You sat in that hospital chair for 2 days straight at the end." My voice stayed even. "That man, the one who did those things, I know he's in there somewhere. But he has not been in this house. Not for a long time?" I paused. "I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because it is the only thing left that might actually help you." I nodded to Lieutenant Simmons. She read him his rights in the measured cadence of someone who has done it enough times to find no drama in it. Just procedure. Torres moved around the table. Danny stood when Torres asked him to, which I was grateful for. He didn't fight it. He started crying when the handcuffs went on, not the heaving kind, just tears running without him seeming to notice them, like something had opened up that he didn't know how to close. He looked at me over Torres's shoulder. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at my son. "I know," I said. "That's why I did this." Torres guided him toward the door. I followed to the porch. The cold hit clean and sharp after the warmth of the kitchen. The street was quiet. A Tuesday morning in January. A few cars on the road. Nobody watching from porches. The cruiser pulled away. Frank stood next to me. Neither of us said anything for a minute. Then Frank said, "You did right, Walt." I nodded. Couldn't find words for a moment. Then I said, "I did what I should have done a long time ago." Frank didn't disagree. The formal statement took most of Monday morning at the sheriff's office. Photos were taken shoulder, hip, documentation of the refrigerator handle. The recordings were copied to the department's evidence log. 41 files, spanning October through January. I sat across a desk and talked for 3 hours, and when I was done, I felt hollowed out in the way that's sometimes actually clean. The DA's office reviewed the evidence and charged Danny with domestic violence, a first-degree misdemeanor in Ohio, and intimidation. He was held until arraignment, then released on a personal recognizance bond, his Uncle Raymond's phone number as a contact. Raymond didn't seem surprised to get the call. Danny appeared before a judge 6 weeks later. His public defender had already approached my attorney. I'd gotten an attorney. Frank insisted on it about a plea arrangement. Danny pled guilty. The sentence was 60 days in a residential treatment facility in Columbus. Mandatory 90 meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. 2 years of supervised probation, and an order requiring him to maintain no contact with me except through a court mediator for 1 year. The judge read the terms in the flat, factual voice of a courtroom, and the whole thing took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to put a frame around 7 months that had changed everything. I drove home alone and sat in the kitchen for a long time. The table still had the good placemats on it. I hadn't changed them since that morning. I sat at the head where I'd sat when Frank was to my right and the food was steaming and Danny was eating a biscuit thinking he'd won. I thought about Helen. I thought about the index card in her handwriting in the recipe box on the second shelf. The way her sevens had a little cross on the stem, the way Europeans write them, something she'd picked up from her grandmother. I thought about what she would say to me right now. I had a pretty good idea. She'd say I waited too long and she'd be right. And she'd also say that I got there, Walt. And that counts. Danny wrote me a letter from the treatment facility, about 5 weeks in. I didn't open it the day it came. I set it on Helen's old writing desk in the hallway and walked past it for 3 days, looking at his handwriting on the envelope he prints in all capitals, has since high school. On the 4th morning, I opened it with my 2nd cup of coffee. He said he'd been sober for 40 days and that the clarity he felt was frightening in its own way, because it meant seeing clearly what he'd done. He said he'd talked about me in group sessions and that talking about it out loud to other people had made him understand the weight of it in a way he hadn't before. He didn't ask to come home. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he was working on becoming someone who deserved a conversation. That was all. I read it twice. I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in the recipe box, next to Helen's sevens. 6 months after Danny completed treatment, his court mediator contacted mine about a supervised meeting. I agreed after 2 weeks of thinking about it, and one long conversation with Frank, and one longer one with my counselor, Dr. Marsh, who I've been seeing since March. We met at a neutral office, a mediator present, chairs on opposite sides of a low table. Danny came in looking different, thinner, yes, but the kind of thinner that comes from a person paying attention to themselves again. He was in clean work clothes. He'd gotten a job in a warehouse in Columbus. He shook my hand before he sat down, which was not a small thing. We talked for an hour. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for more than I was able to give. He asked if there might someday be a chance to build something, whatever I thought that could look like, on my timeline, my terms. I told him I'd think about it. I told him to keep working, keep going to his meetings, keep being the version of himself that wrote that letter. I told him I was not able to promise anything yet about what this becomes. He said he understood. We shook hands again at the door. I drove home. I went to the garage, sat at my workbench, and started working on a repair I'd been putting off for months, an old floor lamp from Helen's parents' house. The wiring completely shot, the socket cracked. I took it apart carefully, piece by piece, assessed what could be saved and what had to go, and began. Some things you can rewire. Some things you have to know the difference. I'm still learning which is which, but I'm here, and I'm learning, and at 65, in this house I helped build, that's enough to work with. There's something I need to say directly, because I know some of you watching this have been where I was, or you know someone who is. And I know the question people ask, the one with judgment baked into it, the one that means, why didn't you do something sooner? Here is the honest answer. The shame of being hurt by your own child is a specific kind of shame that lives in the part of you that spent decades believing love could fix anything if you were patient enough. It can't. Patience without boundaries isn't love. It's just a longer delay on the same outcome. If someone in your family is hurting you physically, emotionally, financially, any of it, you are not betraying them by protecting yourself. You are not failing them by holding them accountable. Sometimes accountability is the only road back to each other that exists. Sometimes it doesn't lead back at all. I can live with both possibilities now. What I couldn't live with was the alternative. If this story reached you where you needed it, say something below. Tell me where you're watching from. If you've been there, let someone else know they're not alone. And if you haven't been there, share it with someone who might be, because sometimes the hardest part isn't knowing what to do. It's knowing that someone else already did it and came through the other side.